The police said the basement was empty, but in the center of the room, they found a single glass jar, and inside it was something they couldn't clearly explain. Still intact, still there, somehow. The house belonged to a quiet old man, the kind of neighbor you'd trust, the kind you see every single day, without ever thinking twice. Until one night, you hear something coming from his basement. Have you ever looked at someone you see every day, a mailman, a shopkeeper, or your next-door neighbor, and felt a cold shiver run down your spine for no reason? Most of the time, it's just our imagination playing tricks. But for Mark, a 24-year-old freelance designer from Ohio, that gut feeling was a warning he should have listened to much sooner. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into a story that sat in police archives for years, a story that proves the most terrifying monsters don't hide under your bed. They live in the house right next to yours. It was the summer of 2024. Mark had just moved into a small, affordable rental in a quiet suburb of Columbus. The neighborhood was perfect: manicured lawns, white picket fences, and the kind of silence that usually suggests peace and safety. His neighbor to the left was Mr. Henderson, a retired widower in his late 60s who spent most of his time gardening. Mr. Henderson was polite, almost too polite. He always wore a straw hat and a faded flannel shirt, even when the humidity was unbearable. But there was one thing that bothered Mark from the very first week: the sound of mechanical humming coming from Henderson's backyard at 3 a.m. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. A low-frequency vibration that rattled the glass of water on Mark's nightstand. One Tuesday night, Mark couldn't sleep. The humming was louder than usual, accompanied by a faint rhythmic thumping. He walked to his window and looked over at Henderson's house. The lights were off, except for one small rectangular window at ground level. The basement. A strange, deep crimson light was bleeding out of that window, casting long shadows across the grass. Mark watched as a silhouette moved past the glass. It didn't look like Mr. Henderson. It was too tall, too unnatural in its movements. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. Instead of going back to bed, Mark decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening. As he approached the fence, the humming suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, the back door of Henderson's house creaked open. Mark froze behind a large oak tree. Mr. Henderson stepped out, dragging a heavy sealed bag. Something dark had soaked into the fabric. He wasn't gardening tonight. He was getting rid of something. The next morning, Mark saw Mr. Henderson in the driveway, waving and smiling as if nothing had happened. "Morning, Mark. Going to be a hot one today?" That smile felt off. Mark nodded and got into his car, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he saw. He started digging online. The house history. The name, Arthur Henderson. At first, nothing unusual. A former refrigeration engineer, decades working for a medical supply company. Then, an old article, 1998, missing persons. Unexplained urban legends linked to the local industrial district. The lead investigator back then had mentioned a suspicious van registered to a subcontracting company. A company where Arthur Henderson was the head of maintenance. 2 days later, Henderson left for his weekly grocery trip. Mark saw this as his only chance. He knew it was illegal. He knew it was stupid. But the feeling in his gut was stronger than the fear of getting caught. He crossed the yard, found the basement window he had seen the red light from, and realized it was unlocked. Squeezing through the narrow opening, Mark dropped onto a concrete floor. The air was freezing, far colder than a normal basement should be. He turned on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows upon rows of industrial freezers. They were labeled with dates and codes: 2004-A, 2012-B, 2023-F. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden workbench, surrounded by the red LED lights. Mark approached the newest freezer, labeled 2024-Current. His hands were shaking. He pulled it open. A cloud of cold vapor erupted. Inside the freezer, there was a startling collection: It was a row of glass jars, each containing a shimmering object, dozens of them, spheres of different colors, suspended in a strange light. Mark leaned closer. One of the objects reacted. He froze. His brain refused to process what he had just seen. Another one shifted slightly. Following his movement, they were still active. They seemed to react to him. Mark stumbled back, hitting the cold wooden frame. The beam of his flashlight shook wildly across the room and landed on a single container sitting apart from the others. It didn't have frost on it. It wasn't sealed, and written on the label, in the same careful handwriting, Mark Reserved. Mark's breath stopped. The contents of the other jars all turned at once toward him. A voice came from the top of the stairs, calm, close. You weren't supposed to wake them up. The basement door slammed shut. The lock clicked. The humming returned. But now it was different, warmer, rhythmic. The objects in the jars began to react faster, following him, pulsing in the dark. They need a new presence, Henderson said softly. Mark ran for the window, but metal shutters slammed down instantly. The lights flickered red, then darker, then deeper. A heavy, sweet mist started filling the room, thick and overwhelming. Mark pressed his shirt against his face, backing into the wall of photos. And that's when he noticed something new. The photos were changing, not physically, but what they showed. In one photo, he was still standing in his kitchen. In another, he was asleep in his bed. In the next, he was the central figure in the basement workspace. Mark turned slowly. The room was ready for its next edition. His vision blurred. The humming filled his skull. The last thing he heard, "Don't worry, you're going to be part of something eternal." When the police finally entered the house 3 weeks later, everything was gone. No furniture, no freezers, no evidence of anything. Just an empty basement and one solitary jar, sitting perfectly in the center of the room. Inside were 2 hazel forms, clear, vibrant, disturbingly lifelike. The officer who picked up the jar later reported something strange. He felt a presence staring back at him. That night, he couldn't sleep. He swore he heard a low humming coming from his own house, from somewhere below the floor. Arthur Henderson was never found, but reports began appearing in other states, quiet neighborhoods, polite old men, and stories of those who left no trace behind after hearing something humming next door. So tonight, if you hear that sound, don't look outside, don't go downstairs, and whatever you do, don't let them catch your gaze.